I really about it all the time when I actually too. I'm like, yeah, how do you get out? No,
Like, classes where it's like fully online or async, I keep people there from.
I remember getting that fitness and classes and stuff. I like two classes in a row. Then I got a few semesters in a row, like two different classes, and I did all of them like a day at one time.
I only have like an hour to do like
I should have done it. I'm gonna do it homework and stuff, but I have to. But this whole weekend, I was doing homework like the whole time. Like on Saturday, I was doing it for like 10 hours. And yesterday, I was doing homework for like 9 or so.
I spent this week writing programs for a video here. I wanted it to read the shield level of worship, and when it gets below, I wanted you to say something. And you know what? That is actually a lot harder than it's. It's like you got to say it, and it's like, oh,
But I wanted it for my philosophy lesson. You carry that and it's like 4 hours. Then you'll know. Once I go, you know,
great word than word.
yeah, your essay's gone. Yeah, you don't even remember, right?
Well, Thursday. Thursday I'm working. Can't work. I'll forgive you for that one. He said no. He isn't posted. Yeah, it's one. Right. I started joking, but then I think he said no. I was like, oh, he's being sarcastic. Haha, funny. And then. Good morning.
Sarcastic. I'm never sarcastic.
That's like the majority of your life.
um,
You style goes a lot further. You can be teaching it all the time. You're making it.
Yeah, I'm gonna use PS to stable. Then some old Greek guy came in and just started talking around and bitching at people. And then we got his on. And then people are like, oh, he's a guy. Yeah. Some people you don't want that. Don't want to be there. Because they don't take care of them. Yeah.
all right. Let's get back to this. First of all, I have not posted this on Canvas yet. I wanted to make sure that I announced it in person first. But I have chosen mercy. We will not meet in person on Wednesday. I'm going to put something online. I don't know. I'm going to keep it short, like a half an hour. I'm not going to do a recorded lecture. I'll think of something else. But there'll be some kind of content for you for over the holiday break. It's going to be pretty short though. I don't want you to take time, out of the holiday in order to try and keep up with class. So we're not canceling per se, but we're not meeting in person. Okay. Which means that we have to get through this content here today. Also, we did move back, if you didn't see it on Canvas, we did move back assignment 4. That's not due until December 4th. Final exams not until finals week. Term papers not until the 18th. So you got most of finals week to do Wait, why is it the 18th? Oh, that's the beginning of finals week. That's why I did it. Okay. So there are some things coming up. The end of the semester doesn't look like it's going to be, well, try to keep up with it, I guess, is what I'm saying. All right, so let's see what we got to do. All right, so last time we were talking about information ethics and data ethics. We were actually starting to talk about information ethics. The first topic, information ethics and data ethics. Data ethics generally applies to people in the data ecosystem, your data brokers, your governments, your corporations, those kind of things. Mostly because average people currently, especially in this nation, don't even have access to those data repositories, let alone to be able to actually actualize them or use them. Typically, when we're talking about data ethics for individuals, usually we're talking about an individual's right to assert a privacy over their own, or at least ownership over their own data. So usually when we talk about ethics, we're talking about information ethics, which comes down to things like intellectual property and censorship and so on. So we started talking about censorship and how, well, it's an issue in our society, obviously, but it's one that has grown up along with the internet and hasn't gone away, probably never will. Because ultimately online interactions come with a certain amount of necessary exposure, right? Buyer beware, and so on. Well, you consume services, you're given something up, right? Web 2.0 was based entirely essentially around give up a certain amount of privacy, and in exchange you get an ostensibly free service. Of course, that's gone quickly away as new services have found all kinds of fun and interesting ways to monetize their services, or at least nickel and dime us into paying generally far more than they're actually worth in the end. But that's not to say that censorship as a topic in and of itself is not one wholly without merit. As we talked about last time, there are arguments both for and against, with the argument for typically being that there's certain kinds of content that shouldn't exist to begin with, and also generally the argument for censorship amounting to, well, think of the children. And of course, we don't want youngins on the internet being exposed to ideas that could corrupt their young, innocent, fragile minds, I guess. That said, the possibility of simply keeping children off the internet comes with its own set of baggage too, because this is their world and they have to grow up in it and they have to live with it and learn to use these tools just as everybody did. And just like learning to swim, at some point you've got to do it. And maybe the best way isn't necessarily to throw people in the deep end. I have conversations along these lines with pro-censorship people all the time. Part of my job as the ISO here is when I was the ISO here, is a certain amount of community service, right? The university exists to educate young minds and create the next Ubermensch, I guess, but also it's to provide services to enrich the community in which we belong. And so that kind of comes with the territory. So sometimes I have to go and talk to parents, if you can believe it or not. And the conversations always seem to go the same way. Parents are extremely concerned about children consuming things online that they ought not, and how do we prevent them from doing that? And they almost never like what I have to say to them because I never give them the answer they want to hear. They want me to tell them what is the best net nanny software. How do I, how often should I be checking my children's email and social media accounts and stuff like that? And the answer I always give them is, of course, it's a highly individualized question, just like no parent can tell another parent how to raise their kids or anything like that. At least we weren't able to do that for the longest time. I don't know if that's going to change or not. But with that measurement comes, a certain amount of acceptance. You have to eventually let go. So for those who argue for censorship, sure, there's a good reason to do that, I suppose. I personally, and again, as we left off last time with me talking about my personal feelings on the matter, and I don't really want to get back into that, but just to summarize, I guess, where we left off is the argument for censorship essentially amounts to an ethical duty to protect minds, particularly young people. And with that, I think that is a school of thought and ethics that I personally find to be largely untenable. If you just think about it for a few moments, right? Does society have an ethical duty to protect the minds of the people with which it is charged? I don't necessarily think so. I'm not even sure how one would even go about that without, of course, running into the problems that we have with censorship, which is who gets to draw that line. So the argument against censorship calls exactly that out. This harkens back to some very pre-internet ideas from John Stuart Mill, who said that censorship is in of itself an unethical act because we can't protect society from knowledge. We may not like the outcome of members of society and their access to information, but that doesn't mean that it's okay to restrict it necessarily. So somewhere, oh yeah, right. And also as part of this, whenever two sides of an argument are presented, of course, there are those who will say, well, the answer must surely then lie somewhere in the middle. Moderate's the great evil of our age, without, of course, understanding that the Overton window does not necessarily fall within that sweet spot they seek. The Overton window is a concept in political science. Essentially, let's say that you have two opposing diametric ideas. In this case, we can use censorship because that's convenient. It happens to also be a political topic as well as an ethical one. So we can say that there are two sides. One of them says that we should ban, I almost use Twitter as an example again. I'm not going to do that. That we should ban, what did the previous slide say? So things like sexism, racism, homophobia, anti-Semitism. That's a perfectly fine place to start, you could say. And the other side simply says that we shouldn't. Well, the Overton window would be that place in the middle to which one side would be willing to compromise in order to move things forward. Now, what if there was one or both sides in this equation that knew precisely, well, it's just like when you negotiate the price on, like you go to a dealership or something, and they're asking 24K for a car. You want to pay 20. Do you say, I'll give you 20? No, of course you don't. You start out low. You say, I'll give you 18 so that you can compromise to the price you actually wanted to pay. The Overton window is the similar sort of concept where if you have one side that says, okay, well, we should ban everything except for sexism. Well, of course, they're not going to say that. Instead, they're going to push that Overton window farther to their side by saying, well, we should definitely ban everything except for 3 topics and then compromise down. You see it all the time. It's a political science concept. But anyway, point is that with the dichotomy that comes along with any ethical or political question, there's going to be those who think that the answer must then surely lie in the middle because, of course, one side can't be more right than the other. But unfortunately, that presents its own set of problems too, in an ethical sense, such as, for example, with the censorship of certain topics in schools, the compromise may be, well, then we'll just present a bunch of information, right? We'll present information from all different sides. And wouldn't that just be fair for everybody? But it ends up not being, because then you end up with a false dichotomy where, for example, certain topics that are scientifically proven and those that are faith-based with no scientific evidence are presented as equal to each other. And of course, that's not necessarily the case. It's the fair and balanced effect, right? It also doesn't necessarily mean that there is an equity in presentation, to say nothing of the fact that, well, then students need to learn 2 sets of things which are not necessarily equally useful, right? We're already learning so many things that aren't necessarily useful to us. Why make it worse? So in the battle of censorship, I guess, the answer is certainly not, let's give 5-year-olds tablets with no filtering on them and chips fall where they may. That's definitely not the answer. But it's certainly not necessarily that we need to sanitize and, in essence, infantilize all of society because there's some information that we consider to be forbidden, right? Now, I don't need to tell you guys about this next one. At the beginning of this semester, we had a quote, which actually wasn't attributed to Socrates, but of course, people attribute to Socrates anyway. But the sentiment was that young people these days gobble their dainties at the table and don't listen to their elders and have too much fun playing sports instead of doing homework and stuff like that. The sentiment that every generation is inferior to the last is as old as generations themselves. But it actually was, I think, now that I think of it, I believe there was a study last week I saw, sent to my email, about how each generation's subsequently, we are snowballing in terms of our ability to store and share information. And so each generation subsequently has a higher intelligence quotient than the one that came before it. I don't know if it's true or not. I didn't actually read the study, but the idea that every generation is inferior to the last, again, as old as generations itself. But when it comes to more recent generations, you guys and my older kids, the truth is that you far surpass previous generations in many different places. One of the places where it's most pronounced, of course, is in your ability to intuit ethical situations, to understand the greater good. You have been raised on utilitarianism your entire lives. And it says something about it. So me sitting here telling you that piracy is bad, I'm not going to make that argument. I can't make that argument. I couldn't in good conscience make that argument, of course. But harder to articulate, perhaps, is exactly the reasons why it's bad or why it's not, right? So piracy, intellectual property theft, intentional or otherwise, has obviously been a problem since the beginning of the internet, right? Lars Ulrich cried to high heaven because Napster was taking money out of the poor mouths of Metallica, and they just couldn't handle it anymore. So they got sued into oblivion. That was a clear web site where you could just visit and download MP3s that were listed by artist and genre and so on. After that happened, of course, Napster, I mean, they came back. I think they're even kind of technically still around, but it sent the message that they wanted it to send, right? The recording artists industry, less so the artists themselves, but more the publishers and copyright holders. All right, let's put it this way. Again, I don't need to tell you guys this because you are able to intuit all of this. But for the sake of the completeness of the story, the record industry, the movie industry, and so on, has not been very ethical to artists ever. I know, it's shocking. So the people who actually hold the copyrights, who benefit most from artists' music, never was the artists themselves. And so when this whole Napster piracy thing happened, of course, nobody was crying in their Cheerios over the poor publishers and their recording industry setbacks and all that kind of stuff. It was already an unethical enterprise. And so no one cared much if it was being taken down a peg or two. But the lawsuit against Napster sent the message that they wanted it to send. And of course, it drove it all underground, right? And that's when we started getting peer-to-peer file sharing networks like LimeWire and so on. Great places to distribute malware, also great places to distribute, of course, copyright material. So, which, speaking of your generation's ability to intuit your way through these ethical situations, the recording industry is full of milestone legal cases against artists who managed to one-up their corporate overlords like Prince and Neil Young and so on. Very recently, Taylor Swift did something similar, and I got to applaud her for it. It was really a masterstroke. Anyway, just got me thinking about it. Yeah, so it drove it all underground, but it didn't go away. But these peer-to-peer file sharing networks suddenly became impossible for those with previous publishing authority, fighting against the tide of progress, I might add, trying to hold on to their relevance in the digital age, suddenly couldn't go after the one sites like Napster because these files were distributed. So instead they had to change their tack and instead went after those who were downloading it because it was the only place where these files were being congregated into a point where lawsuits would rule in their favor because it's the only time where all of this data resembled that which matched their intellectual property. So then they went about suing individuals for sometimes millions of dollars over their piracy, which of course did absolutely nothing in an ethical sense to sweeten their position, right? People already knew that this was a corrupt industry. They were taking advantage of artists. Now they were going after regular individuals. And all of that culminated in the creation of a file sharing system to basically the MPAA, the RIAA, and a bunch of other publishing houses hashed their entire catalog and then put it all into a database. And this Seven Sigma. Yeah, that was the name of it. This system collected information from various different internet service providers and different, well, not just internet service providers, but service providers all over the internet, and basically acted as the same sort of hash database that law enforcement uses when they're trying to track down like known child pornography, except it was trying to see if anyone was violating their intellectual property. But so expensive was this system, and so unpopular was their insistence on enforcing their intellectual property rights against normal individuals just downloading a song. And so unprofitable did that venture end up being that they dismantled it around 2017 or so. This also coincides with a drop in piracy. In 2007 or 2008, it was about 70 to 80% of college-age students were pirating music or movies or TV shows at some point, or had, according to that study, within the last 30 days. By 2017, when they finally dismantled the system, it was down greatly, down to like 20 or 30%. And now, up back to 44% and still climbing, getting closer and closer to that 70% marker that it once was. The reason for that is because what happened between 2008 and 2017 is the consolidation of contents, right? We were able to stream the content we wanted on individual platforms like Spotify or Netflix or whatever, and paying just a modest fee a month to access all that content. It seemed that people were willing to do that, but now that's no longer the case. Right now we have streaming services all over the place: Disney Plus, Paramount Plus, Hulu, Netflix, whatever, Peacock, Tubi, that's all over the place. And it seems people are less willing to pay 10 times $10 a month in order to access the same content. So people are pirating again. But that initial idea that it wasn't really quite so bad, I don't think that ever really went away, right? And why is that? Because they tried to fight piracy with the legal system instead of hearts and minds, right? They could have gotten smart and consolidated all these catalogs sooner. They could have fought against the deconsolidation of those catalogs that's now giving rise to piracy again, but they're not. Business interests are not necessarily the same as consumer interests. So what did they do? What was the message to try and get people to stop pirating? I'm sure you've seen these ads before DVDs. Well, of course, there's the FBI warning. Those have been on movies since way before the internet, because, I mean, technically, you go and rent a movie, you get 2 VCRs and you make a copy of it. That's duplicating their intellectual property. So no, not the FBI warnings, but no, you get the you wouldn't download a car, right? Those ones. And that argument is specious at best, but it is literally the argument that is being made by some experts. They say that from an ethical standpoint, it is no different. Which again, you know, this isn't about my personal feelings, but my personal feelings on that are bullshit. It is. Of course it's not. If I'm running down the street and I knock over an old lady and I steal her handbag, that's obviously unethical. You know, she no longer has access to her handbag. She no longer has access to her money or whatever else might be in there. But if I'm able to duplicate her bag, she still has her bag. Ethically, it's not the same thing. So, right, from a utilitarianism standpoint, that's not the case. So you have to ask yourself in these situations, of course, cui bono, but who does actually lose out on intellectual property theft? Well, the answer to that, again, is the same people who are prosecuting the intellectual property theft to begin with, which are copyright holders. But one could also argue that there are, from a utilitarian standpoint, of course, some good reasons, some ethical benefits from piracy as well. For example, again, see the unethical industry as it stands now. If there is and actually there are studies that corroborate this. If there is a consumer direct way of supporting content creators, plenty of people take advantage of it. That's the whole idea behind Patreon, I mean, I guess to a lesser extent, Kickstarter and other crowdfunding sort of sites like that. It's true that content creators who have a Patreon, I mean, it's not as if the 13 million subscribers one has on YouTube immediately translates to 13 million subscribers on Patreon, but it's a smaller percentage of that. But it's usually enough, right? People are, at least to a certain extent, willing to pay a certain amount to support creators that they enjoy. The difference is that goes directly to creators. Well, not Patreon gets a cut, obviously, but it dismantles the previous system, which means that will be resisted entirely. So we can, I guess, accept for a moment that anything that dismantles those previous systems and throws our entire copyright law into question, we'll just say for a moment that we'll consider that to be an unethical practice. But what else? Okay, well, the publishers who own the copyright, whether it's the recording artists industry or the Motion Picture Association or any of those, well, they benefit from exclusivity and from publishing authority and from holding on to that copyright. Piracy, how many musical careers has it killed? I can't think of a single one. How many has it promoted? There are plenty of artists who otherwise don't have any way to get their music out there. And so distributing them on SoundCloud or YouTube or really any other place where you can just share music in that fashion, it's benefited a lot of different artists, right? Being able to directly connect with an audience is huge for artists who are struggling and otherwise unknown. There is also the issue that we have in digital media right now. Big problem. This might not be one that you're actually familiar with, but this is actually a huge issue that we have to deal with. Digital media was never taken seriously in the early 90s. We have no real archive, no real record of any of the early internet stuff, any of the early video game stuff, any digital media. The best that we have is the Internet Archive, the Wayback Machine. That's it. That's the only real effort that there has been. And we're at having a serious problem now, where all of that old information is slowly decaying, and we just simply can't get that back. So there's also an argument to be made that perhaps file sharing, even if it means intellectual property theft, there is at least some benefit to being able to share this information freely, because that way it's archived. The more the data is shared, the more it's out there, the less likely it is to decay, suffer from digital decay. There's also, if we were to try and do ourselves a little thought experiment here and be a little bit reductive in our reasoning, to say, what is the difference between somebody archiving ebooks, for example, even if they're stolen, but archiving them and then making them available? What exactly is the difference between an individual doing that and a library doing it? Ultimately isn't much difference. It's the same problem that we have at the internet with determining who is a journalist these days. Everyone is. Who's a librarian these days? Everyone is, right? So from an ethical perspective, there are some benefits to piracy. That said, it's still legal, and I'm a professor and this is being recorded. Don't do it. It's illegal. Don't do it. You're hurting those poor somebody can't get caviar because you're, never mind, wait a sec, I'm gonna get in trouble. Point is, there are pros and cons, just as there are with censorship. And of course, the rampant, flagrant Okay, I suppose in order to be fair and balanced about this issue, I will present two ideas as if they are equal. All right. So the argument against piracy, I suppose, is of course, number one, the flagrant disregard for any laws is itself problematic. There's a criminological theory known as broken windows. Essentially, if somebody is flagrantly breaking the law and there are no consequences, then other people around them will see that and they will think, well, I guess I can do it too, right? So it contributes to more lawlessness. We don't want that. That's why we have law as a social control. That's why we have the concept of victimless crimes. We don't want people flagrantly violating law and order. It just leads to a less safe and orderly society. So the argument goes. The other argument, of course, is that creating content on scale takes money, and that means it's an investment, just like with research and development with tech and pharmaceutical companies. Recording any kind of media is a risk, and so you need to have seed money, and that justifies the cost. And if we have flagrant violations of copyright law, well, that kind of leads to a breakdown entirely of the business side of the creative process, right? If somebody owns that copyright, it has to be defended, otherwise see broken windows. So they're fair and balanced. Those are totally equal ideas. All right, but also the way that piracy has changed. Many of you have probably engaged in piracy and not even realized it, because of course, when we think about piracy, we still, well, maybe not you guys, I still think about torrents and all that kind of stuff, which of course is still a problem. But that's not how most people are pirating these days. You're probably doing it without even realizing. Very often, I'll get an email from students on campus who are, on ResNet or something like that, and they want to know why. What's a popular one? I think Crunchyroll does this, but anime streaming sites and stuff. Say, why is this blocked? I just want to watch anime. Well, because they're not hosting those videos with permission from any of the copyright holders. So if we allow you to do that in ResNet, we're contributing to intellectual property theft, and that's a problem for us in terms of upholding safe harbor for the DMCA. So streaming sites are how people are distributing and pirating these days. Most people aren't downloading stuff anymore. So if they do, they're usually ripping it from a stream. Right? So right here, 16 to 24-year-olds, this is 2022. These are the newest numbers. 40%, 16 to 24-year-olds access music through copyright infringement or access music via stream ripping. The most often, we pirate things, again, that we don't otherwise have access to. We're more than happy usually to pay a modest fee to access content to support the process, to make sure that the executives have their caviar and that the artists themselves are able to go on tour and whatnot. But right now, TV shows especially are up in the air, right? You can't get content everywhere. Netflix lost The Office, devastating. Game of Thrones, right, on HBO Max. Not everyone has subscriptions to that, so on and so forth. All these TV shows out there, we can't access them everywhere. So of course, they're very often pirated. Software used to be the biggest thing that was pirated, not so much anymore. Movies and music are dropping off because we have better access to movies and music these days. Paying on demand for movies through streaming services has become the most popular way to consume them. Music through whether it's iTunes or Spotify or something like that. These services, when they're out there, people will use them and congregate. The majority, again, through streaming sites, sometimes through direct download portals, occasionally stream ripping. Torrents are still out there, but usually more trouble than they're worth when they're just available out on streaming sites, right? So that's how it's done these days. Most popular artists ripped in terms of music. Actually, I included this on this slide because I thought this was really interesting. So there's plenty to choose from out there in terms of artists, and we did just get done talking. This module has a couple of documents linked into it from our slides on what your Facebook profile picture reveals about yourself and tracking digital footprints and so on. So artifacts, behavioral artifacts that are left behind in these systems. So basically what I'm getting at is, what might we think would be pirated? Well, of course, if they're black hat hackers with their sunglasses inside and their black hoodies, we're going to expect some kind of throbbing Russian techno music, right? Not the case, right? Ed Sheeran, and of course, piracy in Latin American countries has exploded as they have been locked out, geo-fenced out of a lot of content on Netflix and Spotify and so on. So we see more piracy from those places. Bruno Mars, this is pop. This is top 40 stuff, right? So what does this tell us? What might this tell us? Well, what else do we have? Ebooks, survival hacks, prepper gear, so on and so forth, mental health magic, Mediterranean diet cookbook, Learn C, the ultimate bodybuilding book, and so on. Over here, Windows, Office. I don't know why anyone is downloading. Okay, WinRAR, neural burning. What the hell? AV. Don't get your AV from peer-to-peer networks. Photoshop and FL Studio and so on. So what do we have? Well, I would argue over on the far left with music. I mean, this is popular music, but again, people are usually willing to pay to support content creators if they, number one, know that they're getting, something out of it, and two, if they're willing to invest in it. I would argue that top 40 music, by definition, is kind of background throwaway kind of music, right? It's all a fad, here one day, gone another. You're not exactly, when you go out and you buy your Ed Sheeran record, you're not exactly saying, boy, this is an heirloom I'm going to pass down one day. I'm going to pull my old iPod 1 out of storage and I'm going to play this for my kids one day so they can understand and see this music. So it's not like that, right? This is music that people wouldn't necessarily pay money for, but if they can listen to it for free. Now, does Ed Sheeran, does that hurt or does it help him? The argument, of course, against piracy is that those 7.46 million downloads, that equates to 7.46 records they would have sold if they weren't pirated. That's the argument. But is that the case? I would say no, of course not. That's probably 0.46 million people that would have bought the record but didn't, and probably 7 million people that wouldn't have even bothered to begin with. They did it because it was free and it was easy and it was there, and they probably did it without even realizing, right? And these books, like, are these sales that weren't made? No, it's the same thing. These are books that, again, they don't go on the shelf. We're not talking about New York Times bestsellers here. Right? These are throwaway books. They might have something interesting in them. Somebody probably picked it up. Peloton hacks, getting the most from your bike, right? And the software. I think that this is fairly self-explanatory, right? Windows as an operating system is often essential. It's also expensive, right? Microsoft Office, often essential, also expensive. Adobe Photoshop, same thing. AV, same thing. I don't know why anyone's using Nero or WinRAR these days. They probably shouldn't be, but same thing. Right? Buying a license to those isn't necessarily cheap. So this is probably stuff people would be willing to pay for if they had better access to it and it didn't. What is a Windows OS license these days? $200, $100? Yeah, I think I spent about 100 the last time I bought one. Yeah, that's a lot, right? That's a lot to pay for an OS, especially when every other alternative is free, right? The only reason that you choose Windows over Linux is because you sometimes have to, and sometimes it's what you're most familiar with, but you're only penalized for being a Windows user. So, yeah. But yeah, don't get your AV from file sharing networks. That's a bad idea. There was a while ago, there's a forensic suite that Microsoft has called Coffee. They don't actually make it anymore, but they used to. And piracy was so rampant with Coffee in the 90s that on LimeWire, they, instead of fighting it, decided to start seeding their own coffee versions, except it was poisoned. So that when you ran it, it appeared to work just fine, but it would screw up all of your forensic results, and your hash values would be it was not good. So don't get anything that you intend to trust, I guess, off of file sharing networks. All right. So again, yeah, I'm not going to harp on piracy here. It's a bit hypocritical for me to do so when all of you can intuit your way through that situation. You don't need me to stand here and tell you that the people who actually benefit from the current system probably ought not to, but also out and out theft is probably not the best answer. It's just the most reasonable under the circumstances, right? So our next information ethical dilemma here is the digital divide, which we've talked about a couple of times. So it's the gap between what we experience in terms of technology in 2022 and others in other areas, or those who are less fortunate, how they experience technology. And the whole Obama phones thing, which of course turned into a huge meme back in the 2010s and stuff like that, actually did quite a bit for the average person. Suddenly being able to have access to this technology, not everyone had a laptop or a desktop, not everyone had a smartphone. Being able to have access to that raised a lot of people up into the middle class, because suddenly they were able to make and receive phone calls and email, and they were able to participate in the new digital world that the rest of us were already beginning to take for granted. But that still isn't necessarily the case everywhere. I mean, if you live in fairly large towns, you've probably had broadband internet access for the majority of your life. But if you go just a couple of miles outside the city limits here, if you start to leave the TDS and Charter Spectrum service areas, which goes to Junction City on Highway 10 or thereabouts. So you end up living in Custer or Blanker or Auburndale or any of those other towns along the way. You don't get broadband internet access. You get dial-up. Yeah, it's still a thing. People are still doing that. Other areas, they don't even have that because you still need infrastructure needed in order to do dial-up. So they're on spotty satellite. They're still on 3 meg service, 1 meg service. And that's a big problem because we rely on technology for so much. I mean, think of what the implications are for that in terms of everything from being able to handle inventory for convenience stores all the way up to providing medical services to people, right? We live in a country where there are medical deserts. People can't access any care whatsoever because they just don't live within any serviceable area and don't have enough technology. There's people who live on roads that aren't plowed all winter. So that's the digital divide. And that's essentially the problem, is that, I mean, a rising tide doesn't necessarily lift all ships. Some people are simply being left behind, right? And that's not necessarily an excuse for everyone to sit and wait for everyone to catch up, but it does mean that as a nation, we have a huge infrastructure problem. And usually when we discuss infrastructure in the country, we're usually talking about our roadways, our transportation infrastructure. But we have a huge problem with our energy infrastructure. We have a huge problem with our information infrastructure as well. All of this has gone largely ignored for all of these years. And it's going to be a problem. There's no question about that, right? Because progress is what it is. And as the old Nintendo quit screen says, anything or any progress not saved will be lost, right? So that's the problem we have with digital decay. That's the problem we have with our information infrastructure. We have gotten ourselves to this point, just as our transportation infrastructure reaches a critical point, and eventually we lose out or could even regress to times before critical arteries were created and allowed for the connection of interstate commerce. We might eventually reach a time where our energy infrastructure reaches a critical point and we regress to a time when we just simply do not have the ability to transport energy services to every corner of our nation. But we'll eventually reach a time, unless this is addressed, where our information infrastructure regresses. We no longer have any of that information. As we begin to lose old knowledge, we lose our ability to access new knowledge. This is a critical tipping point for the nation. And this is not just in the United States. This is, of course, globally. There are countries out there that simply, well, I guess in our estimation, would live in another time. There's also another information ethical point of regulated content, which we've talked about, obscenity and loot boxes, gambling, and so on. So I'm not going to go into it again, but this is an information ethics question. But I suppose there is one more thing, I guess, to say. What is this? Oh, right. Yeah. The World Cup happening in Qatar. So that's a nation, obviously, that has strict control over its information sharing systems, journalists, the internet, and so on. The idea when the FIFA organization chose Qatar for the World Cup this year is that, well, as the head of FIFA joked, I suppose, at a press conference shortly after the selection of Qatar to host this year's World Cup, the question presented to him was, what advice do you give for any journalists or athletes or anything that are going to be heading to Qatar for the World Cup that might be gay? And he joked in his answer is that, what did he say? I guess I'll paraphrase it. It was something along the lines, well, I guess refrain from any sexual activity, because of course over there it's illegal and the sentence is death for it. But it does raise an interesting information ethics question, which is not unique to just simply the situation. It's just an example. But of course, regulating pornography, that's something we talked about. Obscenity laws are already in place to govern that. There is, of course, the question of just having a pop-up that asks an 8-year-old if they're over 18 is enough. That is an ethical quandary itself. And if it's not, and obviously that's not enough, what could we do in advance of that in order to prevent minors from being able to access that material? The answer, of course, is carding everyone, which is exactly what places like adult bookstores used to do. Eldorado's down by Quick Trip and the BP on Church Street, just on the other side of Patch over there. If you go into one of those places, just as any other, they'll card you. But on the internet, nobody wants to give their ID to prove that they're old enough to access these materials. So the internet being for porn, of course, is as old as the internet itself, and that is still an ethical question. It's everywhere. And so how do we prevent children from accessing material they're not legally allowed to access? But tied in with that is, of course, the conflation of pornography with sexuality. So there's certain content that some people find to be questionable or against their moral code. And again, this is more of a censorship question, but how would that content be regulated, and where exactly some people draw the line is different than others. Gambling is a similar sort of thing. You know, obviously that's regulated, but it's regulated a lot less online. I mean, technically speaking, if you're going to take out your winnings, the way federal gambling laws work is before you can even play the game, you're supposed to be carded. But anyway, yeah, you do have to be 18 to gamble in some jurisdictions, and in others it's not at all. It's simply illegal. So how do we handle that? And there's been numerous lawsuits over internet gambling. And now gambling is essentially marketed directly to children in some cases. We talked about last week with loot boxes and NFTs and all that kind of content. It's being marketed directly to children. What was that YouTuber? Rice Gum. Rice Gum's gone now, more or less. I think he's still technically on the platform, but he was a huge YouTuber for a little while. What did he top out at? 16 million? Something like that. Large portion of his viewership, of course, was children. They ate that shit up. As soon as he got big, though, he became a sneakerhead and then started getting involved in tie-ins with sponsorships for some very questionable companies. Basically, it was a platform where you would buy mystery boxes, open them, resell them, and so on, kind of like a cross between loot boxes and the stock market kind of a thing. So NFTs before people were really talking about NFTs. And so transparent was this sponsorship and directed even at children, as it were. That's really what got him into hot water. And then iDubbbz did a content cop on him, and that was basically it. So, you know, big problems. What else is there to say? That's probably enough. All right, so here I am talking about all this stuff. The question is, has there ever been any attempt to actually codify any sort of ethics? What is ethics on? Because we can't just apply utilitarianism to utilitarianism in an ethical sense. I mean, I don't want to get too reductive, but I guess I'm kind of forced to. Essentially posits that anything that would be considered to be a net good is, of course, ethical. Anything that would not be is not. But then you run into all kinds of, or you very swiftly run into various ethical quandaries where there's not necessarily universal good, there's not necessarily universal bad. But there's essentially two types of ways of looking at utilitarianism from a high-level perspective. Typically, the one that I subscribe to is whatever is utilitarian, well, whatever would be ethical in a utilitarian sense is that which reduces suffering. Another way of looking at it is anything ethical under utilitarianism would be anything that increases happiness. I don't necessarily ascribe to that because if we consider an ethical situation of we have 3 people and we have 1 loaf of bread, if one person gets the whole loaf, that increases their happiness, but that is not necessarily an ethical decision in that scenario. I think it's better for everyone to be a little bit fed than just one person increasing their happiness. But suffice to say, there have been attempts to have some kind of an ethical framework to work off of when it comes to things online. For example, in 1989, the IAB, the Internet Architecture Board, published RFC 1087, which basically says, and this goes off of also the hacker ethos, which we talked about earlier this semester. Obviously, that was around during this time as well. So some of these kind of cross over with that. But basically, something is unethical or unacceptable if they gain unauthorized access to resources, disrupt the intended use of the internet, which good luck defining that, waste resources through actions like DDoS attacks, waste resources, malware attacks, waste resources, and so on. So that would all be unethical. Destroys the integrity of computer-based information or compromises the privacy of users. It's awful simplistic, and there's a lot of vagueness there that necessarily doesn't work, right? So RFC 1098 or 1087 here, in terms of its impact and longevity, hasn't gone very far. Everyone violates these ethics all the time, including businesses that operate on the internet. They're compromising the privacy of users all the time. Destroying the integrity of computer-based information. Everyone does that all the time. And, you know, it didn't really work out. So another one that you might still see these days because it has actually been adopted. This is prior to ethical frameworks provided by or provided in documents from NIST. But prior to that, the U.S. Department of Health, Education, and Welfare adopted the 5 principles, the Code of Fair Information Practices, and it became official government policy and still exists in those ethical frameworks provided by certain documents in NIST. So there must be no personal data record keeping systems whose very existence is secret. Spoiler alert, they violated that. They still do all the time. There must be a way for a person to find out what information about the person is in a record and how it is used. Again, nope. There must be a way for a person to prevent information about the person that was obtained for one purpose from being used or made available for other purposes without, none of this. So it is still in documents, but again, not a framework that is often being followed. So let's go to a framework that is being followed, because these days, a lot of organizations, including the federal government, they actually, under LISIG's framework, what moves the needle most for those organizations, as we talked about before, is market forces. But sometimes market forces can compel an otherwise apathetic actor, simply because the consequences for violating ethical frameworks means market loss. So a lot of organizations these days, private corporations, the federal government, they're hiring ethicists to like sit on boards and sit in meetings and provide their alternative viewpoints on certain things. This is not a bad thing. I know it's coming on. I'm being cynical about this because that's just my nature. But it is a good thing that they are hiring ethicists and philosophers and those with opposing viewpoints. But ultimately, if we look at the impact that they have, it's simply not very much because they can easily be ignored. They're just advisors. They're not actually holding any positions of authority or power. They're just voices to be heard and then likely ignored. If market forces dictate, it's not necessary. And that's why, from a certain perspective, being a cybersecurity professional, and this again is my personal experience, but as you can see, I'm apparently not alone in this. It is often up to the cybersecurity professional to provide some kind of an ethical viewpoint to certain organizations. And the reason for that is because, of course, we're not necessarily in positions of decision-making authority a lot of the time, but we are the ones who are in a position, for example, to ensure our organization complies with federal regulations, complies with contractual obligations. The entire job of compliance falls under the umbrella of information assurance. And in addition to that, we, even if our principals necessarily don't, we have an ethical framework which we have to abide by. And this is one that I have found most cybersecurity professionals adhere to, whether they are CISSPs or not. And the reason for that is because if you are a CISSP, first of all, and you don't adhere to this code of conduct, you lose your certification. A failure of security at an organization is embarrassing for the organization. Maybe it results in a lawsuit or something. And those, again, market forces, those are bad. But for the cybersecurity professional, it's more than just embarrassing. It's often a professional disaster. It is often the end of your career. So if your organization doesn't act ethically, honestly, not only are you likely to lose your job with that organization in the event something happens, but you're going to have a very difficult time. As I mentioned last week, one of the first places I worked at after I graduated, my first cybersecurity position, the CIO ends up leaving, and the replacement, the former CIO at Target. And this is 2 years after the breach. They don't fail down, they fail up, or at least parallel. Now, if I had been a cybersecurity professional at Target during that breach, probably wouldn't have been working in cybersecurity anymore. So ultimately, all of the, well, it all comes down essentially to you. And so it's been my experience anyway, in all of my cybersecurity positions, that somebody has to advocate, for example, for the trust that customers place within the principal, whoever you're working for. Right? If somebody buys something and their information ends up in a database, there is a pact there of sorts, and there is a trust that is in place with the organization, and by virtue, you, because it is your job to secure it, for example. But more than that, I mean, there has never been a time in my career personally where I've ever had to blow the whistle on a principal or something like that. There have been times I've come very, very close. And there have been times that I've had to tell principals that we need to take action on certain security measures. And if we don't, I have a professional duty to let somebody know. So I've come close a couple of times. And that's the job, right? That's part of it. It's not written in any job description, but somebody has to be the Jiminy Cricket in these situations. And we can't expect businesses to do it because they don't have any imperative, ethical or otherwise, to do the right thing. They have one, and I'm not arguing that they should. God help us, all of these businesses that seem to suddenly grow, you know, morality when it comes to the environment and human rights and so on. It's just so disingenuous, makes me sick. But they have one ethical imperative, which is to make money for shareholders. Right? That should be all they're expected to do. The corporations are made up of people, and we do need people with a conscience in order to make sure that they don't do what they so often do and trample all over everything in their path. And so that's why codes of conduct for professionals exist like this. So this is the ISC squared code of ethics. The ISC squared is the body that administers the CISSP, the Certified Information Security Services Professional certification, as well as many others, which is the gold standard for cybersecurity leadership in the industry. Basically, if you, in order to even get a CISSP, you have to have 5 years of experience in the field. You have to be sponsored by a current member. You can get provisional certification before that, but you don't get full membership unless you have experience and somebody will vouch for you. In order to get it, you have to take an exam, which is considered to be one of the most difficult certification exams that you can. But the reason it's the most difficult is not because it contains arcane topics and stuff like that. I mean, it's hard. There's many domains and you do have to study for it and everything. But the reason that most people fail it is not because of those technical topics. It's usually the ethical questions. And those are the ones that trip people up. Ethical questions like the one that accidentally appeared on the midterm, if you took the one I accidentally published, like, and this actually came from the CISSP, which is changed now, but this was a question that was on there. Things like you have a data center, you have automatic locks, you have an option. In the event of a fire, you can either fail safe or fail secure. Fail secure would mean that the doors are locked, nobody can get in the data center. Fail secure or fail safe means that the door unlocks if it's currently locked, and it remains unlocked until eventually you disable the system. And so you read a question like that and you say, well, I'm a security person. I want to think about security. We need to do things as secure as possible. So we're going to fail secure just in case somebody pulls the fire alarm just so they can get into the data center while everyone's evacuating, right? That's what you think, a security person. But that would be wrong. And as a matter of fact, if you got that question wrong on the former version of the exam, it was impossible to pass the test, mathematically impossible to pass the test, because that is definitely the wrong answer. Because if someone is inside the data center when a fire breaks out, they will die. So fail safe was the correct answer. Because the code of ethics that everyone in the industry has to adhere to places the 4 tenets of the canon specifically in order, right? So the preamble, the safety and welfare of society and the common good, duty to our principal and to each other, requires that we adhere and be seen to adhere to the highest ethical standards of behavior. Therefore, strict adherence to this code is a condition of certification. I have known cybersecurity professionals who lost their certification because it doesn't happen very often. But when it happens, even though cybersecurity is a huge field worldwide, it's a pretty small pond. You know, there's everyone knows everyone in the industry. When something like this happens, everyone hears about it. But number one, and of course in order, so most important, is to protect society, the common good, necessary public trust and confidence, and the infrastructure. 2 is to act honorably, honestly, justly, responsibly, and legally. 3, it made the list, but it's number 3, is to provide diligent and competent service to principals. And 4 is to advance and protect the profession. As a matter of fact, in order to maintain your certification for CISSP, you have to recertify. And as part of that process, you have to contribute to the field. If you publish a paper, if you take a class, teach a class, if you go to conferences, you have to actually participate in order to keep your certification. So it's not one that you get and you forget about. You have to keep it up. Professor Flugoff used to be a CISSP, but he let it lapse because he's a data scientist and it's not really worth it to him. I maintain mine because for cybersecurity students, if you need a mentor, they have to be a CISSP. So I keep mine. Also, I still do security consulting stuff. But one of the reasons that I keep it also is because this code of ethics, I believe in it. I think that it's got its priorities straight. I think that if your principal is doing something that would violate the common good, necessary public trust or confidence, I think that that should rate higher. even if it means going against the person who signs your paychecks. And they say to never bite the hand that feeds, but kind of comes with the territory. All right, so we're running out of time here. Do we have enough time to actually get through this, or is it something I'm gonna have to save? 14 minutes. Yeah, let's see if we can get through it. I'll do it fast. All right, so that's information ethics. Data ethics, again, is a different thing. Data ethics is typically for data brokers and governments and corporations and so on, but really it involves basic tenets of data ownership. I mean, right now these data warehouses are out there. Your information is being bought and sold all over the place. And just basic ideas that you have rights essentially connected to your identity, that you have agency over your data. Whether that agency means the right to get rid of it, the right to monetize it yourself, the right to at least know where it exists and what it's being used for, and all of that is involved in data ethics. And the reason that it's important is because data can be abused all the time. Now, you might not think it's a big idea, or big deal, sorry. You might not think it's a big deal, but some of the biggest data warehouses that we have in the United States are with the credit reporting bureaus. And they are using that information in order to determine whether or not you're worthy of credit, whether or not you're worthy of extending a loan. So if you want to buy a house, you want to buy a car and stuff like that, all of that now is going to involve your data from innumerable number of sources that is all being crunched through inscrutable algorithms to eventually assign some kind of a factor to you as a person on your worthiness to have these things. And God damn it, the deck is already stacked against every one of us, but especially against all of you. You certainly don't need anyone's help in all of that. It's already, we're already having a housing crisis and inflation and recession and all of that. We don't need to make it any worse, because data can be abused. It can lead to identity theft, sure. It can lead to discrimination, sure. All of that's a problem. But even the consumption of this data in a system that does not have any basis in ethics cannot produce ethical results. It's the fruit of the poison tree. So we can do analytics and we can surmise all this information, but at some point we have to stop and consider the significance of these systems and whether or not it's actually beneficial in the end. That maybe we don't need to quantify risk to a molecular level. Maybe it's okay at times to take chances on people, even if it means, like for example, with insurance risk pools. Maybe it's okay to insure people who might need insurance more than others, simply because it's of greater benefit to society, even if it means premiums go up, or hey, better yet, let's not have premiums at all. Wait a second, that's not what we're talking about. Some examples of how data can be abused, all right? I think I told this example before, it's not on this list right now, but there is the story, of course, a Target who uses their shoppers' habits, goes into a big, data brokerage, analytical and stuff, all that happens. So that, of course, they can give you coupons and whatnot. And there's the story of the father that goes out to the mailbox one day and finds Target coupons for diapers and stuff like that, because the daughter went in and bought a pregnancy test and then didn't go back for a second one, or didn't resume shopping normally as somebody who wasn't pregnant, and so they assumed that they were correct. That's neither here nor there, I guess. But for example, dating apps sell users information all the time. OkCupid does it, Tinder does it. They share that information with third sites, including political views. I mean, and when you join a dating site, they ask you a million questions, ostensibly, in order to match you with somebody with which you are compatible. But all of that information gets sold as well and used in various different data warehouses and trading, buying, selling. Grindr was doing the same thing. They were also sharing users' HIV statuses. They were able to do that because although obviously that's a medical diagnosis and would normally fall under HIPAA, Grindr is not a medical service provider, and users would supply that information voluntarily. So from an information ethics standpoint, there's no harm, no foul. Well, there's harm, but there's nothing illegal going on there. But from a data ethics standpoint, yeah, that's kind of a problem. My Days is a menstrual tracking app, and they too would buy and sell their users' information. including information about their medical procedures, and would share that specifically with insurance companies. Insurance companies love big data. They love to buy that shit. And the reason that they do that is because they make more money the better they can quantify risk. If people are paying premiums but never actually need insurance, they get to keep that money. So they love data, and they love being able to quantify exactly what somebody's risk profile is, so they can include them into pools of higher or lower premiums. So yeah, they're buying things like menstrual tracker information so that they can determine whether or not somebody is more risky because they apparently suffer from insomnia, or if they have an irregular cycle, it could point to, you know, other medical issues. So this brings us to a concept also of data sovereignty, because while you as individuals have the right to assert control over your own data, governments have also asserted a certain right to control the data of their citizens as well. And there's actually a really big legal question as to whether or not the government owns your data or you do, because most of the systems that generate this information are government systems. Typically, information in systems belongs to the people who own those systems, so the government. And we can keep that quiet because, of course, it's their system, and we don't have to tell the American people about this kind of information, which led to some major revelations when Edward Snowden, the US government contractor, leaked a bunch of information from government systems, which we will talk about more. Okay, that's what I'll do a video about then for Wednesday. We'll have to leave it there. I got to get going. Take it easy. Enjoy your holiday break. We will see you back here in person next Monday.